When people compare the United States and Iran, the conversation often begins and sometimes ends with raw military power. On paper, the United States operates in an entirely different category. It possesses the most advanced air force, a globally deployed navy, satellite intelligence networks, and precision strike capabilities that no other country can match at scale. It can project force across continents within hours. In traditional strategic thinking, that kind of dominance would normally settle the question. But international politics rarely rewards simple comparisons of strength. Power is not just what you can do, it is also what you can prevent others from doing and what you are willing to risk in the process. And this is where the US-Iran dynamic becomes far more psychologically complex than a standard military imbalance. Iran does not try to compete symmetrically. It does not attempt to match the United States tank for tank, carrier for carrier, or fighter jet for fighter jet. Instead, it operates in what strategists often describe as the space of asymmetric warfare, where the goal is not battlefield victory in a conventional sense, but the ability to impose uncertainty, cost, and hesitation on a far stronger opponent. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. For the United States, military power is structured around clarity and control. It prefers identifiable targets, defined objectives, and decisive outcomes. But Iran's strategic logic is built on ambiguity. It thrives in environments where attribution is difficult, where escalation is gradual, and where every move can be answered in multiple unpredictable ways. This includes missile capabilities, drone warfare, cyber operations, and the use of allied non-state actors across the region. None of these tools individually match US power, but collectively they create a distributed system of pressure that is difficult to fully eliminate. Now, and this leads to a deeper psychological layer in the competition. Deterrence is not only about capability, it is about perception. The United States must constantly calculate not just whether it can win a confrontation, but what winning would actually cost. Iran, by contrast, does not need to win outright. It only needs to ensure that any conflict becomes sufficiently expensive, politically complicated, or regionally destabilizing that the threshold for US action rises significantly. In that sense, Iran's strategy is designed to operate at the edge of escalation, not beyond it. This creates a persistent strategic tension. The stronger power must always consider restraint, while the weaker power can afford selective escalation. Historically, this kind of imbalance produces what political scientists sometimes describe as controlled instability. Neither side fully controls the environment. The United States can dominate any conventional battlefield, but Iran can influence the conditions under which that battlefield is entered in the first place. This is not a quality of power. It is a form of strategic friction. There is also a philosophical dimension to this imbalance. Modern military supremacy often creates an expectation of predictability, the assumption that overwhelming force leads to predictable outcomes. But asymmetric actors challenge that assumption by refusing to play by the same rules of engagement. They introduce uncertainty not through strength, but through adaptability. And in international politics, uncertainty is a form of power in itself. We should also consider the role of escalation dynamics. In any confrontation between the US and Iran, the most dangerous moments are rarely the planned actions. They are the reactions. A limited strike, a maritime incident, or a proxy attack can trigger chains of response that neither side fully intends. This is where asymmetric warfare becomes particularly significant. It does not need to be large scale to be strategically meaningful. It only needs to be sufficient to force a response that shifts the broader balance of risk. From Washington's perspective, this means constantly managing the gap between capability and commitment. From Tehran's perspective, it means ensuring that any confrontation remains below the threshold of existential threat while still signaling resolve. Both sides are engaged in a continuous calibration of pressure, restraint, and signaling, and this is why the military comparison alone is misleading. The United States holds decisive superiority in conventional warfare. That is not in question. But Iran's advantage lies in shaping the environment in which that superiority is exercised. One side dominates the game board, the other influences how and when the pieces are even allowed to move. And so, when we talk about strategic advantage, we are really talking about two different forms of power: the ability to act decisively and the ability to disrupt decisiveness in others. In that tension, neither side achieves total control. Instead, they operate inside a fragile equilibrium where strength and vulnerability coexist in the same system. And perhaps the most important insight is this: in modern geopolitics, dominance does not eliminate risk. It often redistributes it in more complex and unpredictable ways. Because in the end, power is not just about who can strike harder. It is about who can shape the choices of everyone else before the strike ever happens. If military power explains part of the U.S.-Iran relationship, economic power explains another layer, but in a much more complicated and less predictable way than people often assume. Because in theory, the United States sits at the center of the global economic system. It has deep capital markets. The dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency, and its financial institutions shape international trade flows. That gives Washington an extraordinary form of leverage. Sanctions, banking restrictions, export controls, and secondary pressure on companies that want access to the U.S. market. In a conventional sense, this should be overwhelming. And at times it is. Economic sanctions have placed enormous strain on Iran's economy, reducing access to global markets, limiting foreign investment, and contributing to inflationary pressure and currency instability. So, from a purely structural perspective, it looks like a clear imbalance, one side embedded in the core of global finance, the other partially isolated from it. But here is where geopolitics becomes more psychological than mechanical. Sanctions are not just economic instruments. They are instruments of expectation management. They work not only by restricting resources, but by shaping behavior through anticipation. The assumption is that over time, economic pressure translates into political change or strategic compliance, and sometimes it does. But Iran represents one of the clearest examples of how states adapt, absorb, and reorganize under sustained pressure rather than simply collapsing under it. Instead of full integration into the Western-led financial system, Iran has increasingly developed alternative pathways. These include regional trade networks, informal financial channels, barter-like arrangements, and closer economic ties with non-Western partners who are themselves operating partially outside U.S. influence. So none of these mechanisms fully replace the efficiency of global markets, but they create a parallel system, less efficient, more fragmented, but still functional enough to sustain the state. This is where an important psychological shift occurs. Sanctions are designed to isolate, but over time, they can also normalize adaptation. When a system operates under restriction long enough, it begins to treat constraint as a structural condition rather than a temporary shock. And once that happens, the expected political impact of economic pressure becomes less linear. From Iran's perspective, economic survival becomes a question of resilience rather than prosperity. That distinction matters because resilience does not require growth. It requires endurance, and endurance changes the strategic calculation. A state that prioritizes survival under constraint behaves differently from a state that assumes integration into global prosperity is the default trajectory. Meanwhile, the United States faces its own constraints within this system, even though they are less visible. Sanctions are powerful, but they are not cost-free. They require enforcement across allies, coordination with global financial institutions, and constant maintenance of credibility. Overuse can also accelerate the very fragmentation they are meant to prevent. If too many actors begin building alternative systems to bypass U.S. financial authority, the long-term structural dominance of that system becomes more contested. So what we see is not absolute economic control, but contested economic influence. There is also a deeper philosophical tension here about the nature of power in a globalized economy. Economic globalization was supposed to create convergence, a world where integration would reduce conflict because interdependence raises the cost of disruption. But what we are witnessing instead is something more fragmented, interdependence without alignment. Countries remain economically connected, but politically misaligned. They rely on the same global system, but do not share the same strategic assumptions. Iran operates inside this contradiction. It is not fully inside the Western economic order, but it is not completely outside it either. It exists in a hybrid space, partly constrained by the system, partly adapted to operate around it. And that in-between position creates a different kind of strategic behavior, less focused on growth maximization, more focused on constraint management. From the U.S. perspective, this creates frustration. Economic tools that once appeared decisive now produce slower, more ambiguous outcomes. Pressure builds, but the political response does not always follow the expected trajectory. Instead of immediate compliance, you often see adaptation, redistribution, and in some cases, deeper entrenchment. And this leads to a broader insight about modern power. Economic dominance is not the same as economic determinism. Just because one actor sits at the center of the financial system does not mean it can fully dictate outcomes at the periphery. Influence is real, but it is filtered through local political logic, regional alliances, and domestic priorities that do not always align with external pressure. In that sense, sanctions become less like a switch and more like a dial. They adjust conditions, but they do not fully control direction. So, when we ask who holds the economic advantage, the answer is not simply about scale or access. It is about adaptability under pressure versus leverage through structure. The United States holds structural dominance in global finance. Iran holds adaptive experience in surviving outside its full reach. And between those two realities lies a more uncomfortable truth. Economic power today is no longer just about who can include others in a system, but also about who can function when partially excluded from it. So, because in a fragmented global economy, the real question is not who controls the system completely. It is who can still operate meaningfully when the system no longer behaves as expected. And that brings us to a deeper reflection. In a world where even economic pressure no longer guarantees predictable outcomes, power is no longer just about control. It is about endurance and uncertainty, and the ability to shape outcomes in systems that refuse to stay stable. When we move from military and economic power into regional influence, the U.S.-Iran competition becomes even more complex, because here we are no longer talking about direct control. We are talking about networks, relationships, loyalties, and perceptions that operate beneath the surface of formal statecraft. The United States approaches regional influence through alliances. It relies on formal partnerships, defense agreements, and long-standing security relationships with key regional actors. This model is structured, institutional, and visible. It is built on predictability, shared interests, coordinated military planning, and diplomatic alignment. In theory, this creates stability through integration. The more aligned the region is with U.S. partners, the more stable the overall order becomes. But Iran operates through a fundamentally different logic. Instead of building influence primarily through formal alliances, it builds influence through what we can call distributed alignment, often involving non-state actors, political movements, and armed groups that operate with varying degrees of independence but share overlapping strategic interests with Tehran. This is what people often refer to as Iran's proxy network strategy. But that phrase can sometimes be misleading if we interpret it too narrowly as direct control. In reality, it is less about command and control and more about shaping a field of influence where multiple actors, each with their own motivations, still converge in ways that serve Iran's broader strategic objectives. And this is where the psychological dimension becomes critical. Traditional diplomacy assumes clarity of relationships, ally versus adversary, partner versus competitor. But Iran's regional strategy deliberately blurs those categories. So it creates environments where influence is indirect, layered, and sometimes deniable. That ambiguity itself becomes a form of power because it complicates response options for external actors like the United States. When influence is clear, it is easier to counter. When it is distributed across multiple actors with varying degrees of autonomy, it becomes significantly harder to dismantle without unintended consequences. The United States often faces a structural dilemma here. Its alliances require stability and legitimacy, which depend on functioning state institutions. But Iran's influence often operates in environments where state authority is weaker, more fragmented, or contested. In those spaces, non-state actors can become more relevant than formal governments in shaping security dynamics on the ground. This creates a kind of asymmetry in regional engagement. The U.S. is optimized for working with states. Iran is often more agile in environments where state structures are fragile or contested. Neither approach is universally superior, but they operate in different political ecosystems. Over time, this produces a layered regional reality. On the surface, you see formal diplomatic relationships, summits, and strategic partnerships involving the United States and its allies. But beneath that surface, you see parallel networks of influence that operate through militias, political coalitions, and localized power structures that are not fully aligned with any single capital. And this is where the concept of control becomes misleading, because in such an environment, no single actor fully controls the outcome. Instead, what exists is a constantly shifting balance of influence, where local and regional actors often have more immediate impact on events than external great powers. From a psychological perspective, this changes how deterrence works. The United States can signal overwhelming military capability, and that signal is understood. But Iran's influence operates more quietly through embedded relationships that create persistent presence rather than episodic demonstration of force. One is visible and concentrated, the other is distributed and persistent. There is also a feedback loop here that is often overlooked. As regional instability increases, non-state actors tend to gain more relevance, and as they gain more relevance, external powers are forced to engage with them indirectly, even when they prefer not to. This gradually normalizes a fragmented regional order where influence is no longer monopolized by states alone. In that environment, Iran does not need to dominate the region outright to be strategically significant. It only needs to maintain enough influence across key nodes, political, military, and geographic, that it can shape outcomes in moments of crisis or escalation. That is a very different model of power than traditional imperial or alliance-based systems. Meanwhile, the United States still retains enormous influence through its partnerships, military presence, and diplomatic reach. But it must constantly manage the cohesion of its alliance network, ensure coordination among diverse partners, and respond to events that are often shaped by actors outside formal state structures. That requires not just power, but sustained political attention and alignment across multiple governments with different priorities. So, what we are really seeing is not a simple competition between two opposing blocs. It is a competition between two different models of regional order. One is hierarchical and alliance-based. The other is networked and asymmetric. And in a world where regional stability is increasingly fragile, the networked model often proves harder to fully suppress, even if it is easier to contain at times. But containment is not resolution, it is management. And management, by definition, is continuous, not final. So the deeper question is not who has more allies or who has more influence in a traditional sense. The question is whose model of influence adapts more effectively to a region where power is no longer concentrated at the top, but dispersed across many actors who are all responding to uncertainty in real time. And that leads us to a sobering realization. In today's Middle East, influence is not about occupying the center of the system. It is about knowing how to operate in the spaces between order and disorder, where the rules are unstable and the outcomes are never fully under anyone's control. Because in the end, regional power is not just about who you can align with, it is about who still responds to you when alignment itself begins to fracture. If we step back from military capability, economic leverage, and regional influence, there is one final dimension that often becomes decisive in the US-Iran dynamic: the ability to project power into the global system at moments that matter most. But even here, the comparison is not as straightforward as it might appear. The United States remains the central actor in global power projection. It has the ability to operate simultaneously across multiple regions, maintain naval presence in critical sea lanes, and mobilize military and intelligence assets at a scale no other country can match. In traditional geopolitical terms, this is the definition of global reach. It is the ability not just to defend interests at home, but to shape outcomes far beyond national borders. This global presence is not just physical, it is systemic. The United States sits at the core of international institutions, financial networks, intelligence sharing alliances, and logistical frameworks that underpin global order. That means its influence is not limited to moments of crisis. It is embedded in the architecture of the system itself. But here is where the analysis becomes more subtle. Iran does not compete with the United States in terms of global reach. Instead, it competes in terms of strategic disruption, and disruption, when applied at the right point in a complex system, can have effects far larger than its immediate scale would suggest. Iran's most significant leverage does not come from projecting force everywhere. It comes from its ability to concentrate influence in narrow but highly sensitive choke points, both geographic and strategic. So the most often discussed example is the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. A relatively small disruption in that region can ripple through global energy markets, affect inflation expectations, and shift political calculations in distant capitals. This is a crucial point. Global systems are not equally sensitive everywhere. They are highly concentrated in certain nodes. And power in such a system is not just about size, it is about position. The United States operates as a system-wide stabilizer. It seeks to ensure continuity of trade routes, energy flows, and financial predictability. Its power projection is designed to reduce uncertainty in the global order. Iran, by contrast, often operates as a selective stressor within that same system. It does not need to destabilize everything. It only needs to introduce uncertainty in specific locations that force broader recalibration. This creates a paradoxical relationship. The stronger actor tries to preserve system stability. The weaker actor identifies the points where stability is most vulnerable and applies pressure there. One acts as a global balancer, the other as a localized disruptor with global consequences. And psychologically, this produces very different strategic mindsets. For the United States, global power projection is about credibility. It is about demonstrating that commitments are real, alliances are reliable, and rules are enforceable. Any perception of retreat or inconsistency can have systemic effects on confidence. That means the US is often not just reacting to events, it is managing expectations about its role in the system. For Iran, global impact is less about maintaining consistency and more about preserving optionality. It benefits from ambiguity, keeping potential responses open, maintaining strategic uncertainty, and ensuring that adversaries must constantly factor in multiple possible scenarios. This flexibility is a form of leverage in itself because it complicates planning for any opponent trying to predict its next move. There is also an important asymmetry in risk perception. The United States must consider the broader consequences of escalation across a global system it helps maintain. Every action is filtered through alliances, markets, and international norms. Iran, operating outside the center of that system, often has a narrower but more focused risk calculation. That does not mean it takes risks lightly, but the distribution of consequences is different. This is why small actions in localized theaters can sometimes generate disproportionate global effects. In a tightly interconnected system, disruption does not need to be large to be significant. It only needs to touch the right pressure point at the right time. And this brings us to a deeper philosophical insight about modern global power. We are no longer living in a world where control is distributed evenly across geography. We are living in a world of concentrated interdependence. Certain nodes, energy routes, financial systems, maritime choke points carry outsized importance compared to their physical size or population. In such a system, power is not only about projection across distance, it is about sensitivity to disruption at key points of connection. The United States excels at maintaining the overall architecture of that system. Iran, meanwhile, demonstrates how influence can emerge from the ability to challenge specific points within it. Neither approach is absolute. The United States cannot eliminate all sources of disruption without significant cost. Iran cannot translate localized pressure into full systemic control. But both operate within a shared reality. Global stability is not guaranteed by dominance alone. It is constantly being negotiated at the edges of vulnerability. And this is where the strategic relationship becomes most revealing. The United States is ultimately responsible for sustaining a global order that depends on predictability. Iran operates in the gaps of that order where predictability breaks down and uncertainty becomes leverage. So, when we ask who holds the advantage in global power projection, the answer depends on what we mean by advantage. If we mean the ability to sustain global systems over time, the United States clearly holds the dominant position. But if we mean the ability to create moments of global disruption that force attention, recalibration, and response, then Iran holds a different kind of leverage, smaller in scale, but highly concentrated in effect. And in today's interconnected world, those moments matter more than they might appear on a balance sheet of power. Because global influence is no longer just about who can move the most forces across the world. It is about who can trigger reactions that travel farther than the original action itself. And that leaves us with a final reflection. In a tightly connected global system, power is not only measured by reach or strength, it is measured by sensitivity, timing, and the ability to turn small points of pressure into global consequences that no actor can fully control once they begin.